Раз, раз. Раз, два, три. Раз. Thanks. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name's Christopher Gerry, and I'm the Rector of the University of Central Asia. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's presentation and discussion of the 2024 World Development Report on the so-called middle income trap. I'm delighted that we're holding this event in partnership with the World Bank. And so let me start by extending my thanks to them for their support and engagement in our mission at UCA, which involves, like theirs, supporting the development of the Central Asian region. In particular, I'm delighted to welcome Hugh Riddell, the World Bank country manager here in Kyrgyzstan, David Knight, the lead country economist and program leader for Central Asia, Ivailo Izvorski, the World Bank's chief economist for Europe and Central Asia, and a special surprise for me, Misha Lokshin is here, who I met last in 2002 in Moscow. And whilst he doesn't remember me, I remember with great affection his talk on the Russian longitudinal monitoring survey with Popkin. So it's good to see you, Misha. I believe this is one of many global presentations of the World Development Report, and it's particularly appropriate that UCA is able to co-host this event in Central Asia, given our presence legally and physically in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, the three countries in which which are our founding states, as well as our active engagement and interest in the other Central Asian states and indeed in Afghanistan. Now, as some of you will know, those that follow the World Bank's output, the 2024 World Development Report highlights a critical challenge facing more than 100 countries around the world, namely the struggle to move from middle income status to high income status. And this is a challenge that's now frequently referred to as the middle income trap. I think that was a phrase coined a couple of decades ago in some other World Bank report. And it captures the situation where economies get stuck in a kind of growth stagnation, unable to transition from investment-driven growth into innovation-driven growth. And here in Central Asia, as much as anywhere else in the developing world, this issue is particularly pertinent. The countries in this region, of course, have made significant strides in economic development since their most recent independence over 30 years ago. Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan are now classified as upper middle income countries, while Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan remain classified as lower middle income countries. But as we see globally, the road to sustained prosperity is anything but linear. Central Asia's economies are growing, but as they seek to transition to high income status, they face considerable challenges in terms of diversification, technological adoption, institutional strengthening, environmental degradation, and the challenge of inclusive growth. And these issues are, of course, compounded in our region by geopolitical tensions, resource dependency, and socioeconomic inequalities that further complicate the path forward. As too, I might add, does the recent change in government in the United States. Globally, the middle income trap is a topic of increasing relevance. Developing economies, particularly in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, face similar challenges as they try to diversify their economies and leap into higher productivity sectors. But what makes Central Asia particularly significant is the region's geopolitical and economic positioning, bridging the gap between East and West, rich in both natural resources and cultural heritage, yet still facing substantial barriers to greater regional cooperation, economic mobility, and inclusive development. So as we discuss the implications of the middle income trap for Central Asia, let us think collectively about how the lessons from the World Bank's report might be adapted to our region, taking into account the uniqueness of the challenges we face. How can we ensure that Central Asia doesn't just remain in the lower middle income zone, but thrives by leveraging off its strengths, whether that be its relative youth and demographic advantages, its rich cultural history, its natural resources, or indeed its growing proclivity towards the digital economy. So we, and I personally, am excited to have this event today because it gives us the chance to critically engage with these fundamental questions relating to our economic development and performance, and to explore how we can work together, potentially across sectors, across countries, and across disciplines, to overcome the barriers to long-term prosperity. At UCA, of course, we're committed to helping build the human capital, as well as the research and educational capacity that forms an essential driver of economic development in any region. And partnerships like the one with the World Bank are central to this mission. So once again, I thank the World Bank for being here today, and I look forward to an engaging and insightful discussion. Thank you very much. Now, before we continue, there is a slight change to the advertised agenda. Firstly, according to the agenda, I was to hand over to Hugh to make opening remarks. Instead, Hugh is going to make closing remarks. Following that, there was going to be a presentation of the World Development Report itself. Unfortunately, our presenter is sick and hasn't been able to travel to us. So instead of this, we're going to move straight to the second presentation, which will be slightly longer now. So I'd like to invite our second speaker to the floor, Mr. Ivailo Izvorski, who's going to speak on getting to high income in the East European and Central Asian region. Do you want to go and make a couple of, okay, we're going to have a brief 2-minute presentation from David Knight on the report itself, and then we'll move into the second presentation and then into a Q&A and discussion involving four panelists. Okay, David.
Thank you very much, and thanks so much, Dean Gerry and everyone for having us here. This is really an honor, and it's great. I've been working in Central Asia for a couple of years, but I think this is the first time that we've had such a event co-organized with preeminent university in the region. So thanks so much. I'm looking forward to a lot of these collaborations. I will just make a couple of brief remarks about the World Development Report. And then after that, as Dean said, we'll jump straight into a detailed, in-depth analysis of the issues of the WDR in this region. So a little more focused and also hot off the press from our regional chief economist. So we prepare World Development Reports every year, have done so since 1978. I'm sure you're all avid readers of it. You have it on your news stream. The WDRs cover a very diverse range of topics. It's a different topic every year, and it looks at all sorts of different things. I think in previous years, we have looked at finance, data, governance, health, many topics. So the topic of the latest World Development Report, as has been said, is the middle income trap and how countries can either escape it or avoid it. This topic has been around in development parlance for a couple of decades. I think it was initially coined in the context of some East Asian and Latin American countries that at the time were struggling to make the break to high income. But unfortunately, if anything, it's become even more widespread since then. So it's remained a topic high on the debate, and it's continued to be relevant for the growing group of middle-income countries. So the middle-income countries that we're talking about, these actually account for the majority of the world's population, the majority of the world's poor, the majority actually of global greenhouse gas emissions, but a minority of economic activity. And and recently, and unfortunately, we have seen the economic prospects for middle-income countries worldwide to be, if anything, diminishing. So as a group, on average, middle incomes grew by 6% per year in the 2000s. That slackened to 5% in the 2010s, and then down to 4% last decade. So in short, we're not heading in the right direction. Looking backwards, something needs to change. And really, the aim of this report is to set out to map out a simple growth framework for avoiding and escaping the gap that can then be applied in many different middle-income country contexts. I won't say much about the report because, again, when Ivailo comes up, he will apply all of those principles and recommendations and more to the context of the Europe and Central Asia countries. But just a couple of notes. First of all, I think if we were to say there's three key challenges for middle-income countries as we see them now. One is that they face growth slowdowns. So it's not just slow growth. Actually, middle-income countries can and do grow quickly, as we can see here in Kyrgyzstan at the moment. However, they are far more likely to not be able to sustain that growth than high-income countries. In fact, I think more than 40% of middle-income countries face growth slowdowns compared to less than 15% of high-income countries. So it's getting that steady, good growth that is critical. The second key factor is inefficiencies in their economic structures. So traditionally, we think about development as accumulation of capital, physical capital, human capital, and that is important, certainly. But now we look at middle-income countries and see that relative to some benchmarks, if you take, for instance, the US economy as an example of a high-income country, middle-income countries actually have quite a lot of capital. They have more than 70% of the capital that the US has, for instance. But with that capital, they're only producing 20% of the GDP that the US produces. So it's not actually the capital that they're missing that is the main problem. It is the inefficiency of how they use it. So I think this raises a lot of questions. And thirdly, the growing headwinds that are facing the world, but especially middle-income countries now. And Dean Gerry referred to some of them. Protectionism is very much in the news nowadays, and provides an additional obstacle to tried and tested development routes, but also higher debt burdens in much of the developing world, in the middle-income world now, than we have seen a couple of decades ago. And also demographic challenges in some countries of different sorts. But in Central Asia, and including in the Kyrgyz Republic, we are lucky to have a rapidly growing population. But of course, then the economy needs to grow even more rapidly to afford for greater prosperity for everyone. So how do you avoid the trap? I will not answer it satisfactorily, but Ivailo, I think, will do, and hopefully it'll be cause for good discussion. But I think the WDR focuses on three things, another group of three. First is investment. So, of course, the investment is important, and at the initial stages of development, it is important to accumulate human capital, physical capital. But I think as countries progress, and this is what the Kyrgyz Republic is looking to do now, increasingly critical is the processes of infusion and innovation. So what do we mean by infusion and innovation? So infusion is moving towards the production frontier, using your resources more efficiently, using existing know-how, technology, and techniques. So it's trying to bring in the best practices existing. And this, for instance, would help to bridge this gap between the high capital but low GDP rates. And innovation, of course, increasingly as you move towards to break out of middle income into high income, So I think that's just to give a little encapsulation of the WDR, which is out in, I don't know if we can go to the last slide in case anyone hasn't read it from cover to cover yet. There is a QR code there. You can Google it. If we can skip to, or you may have skip. Yeah, just you were just on the QR. Yeah, there we go. So here's just the last slide. And with that, I think I'll hand over to Ivailo for the main presentation. Thank you.
Switch. I'm going to talk about the countries of Europe and Central Asia. These are 23 economies, of which 3 are high income. Poland, Romania, Croatia, 20 are middle income, have GDP per capita from about $1,000 to about $14,000. Economies with income above that, we call high income countries. Tajikistan and Kyrgyz Republic are at the very bottom of that middle income range, but nonetheless, they're still middle income countries. And for them, even though the transition to high income is probably several decades away, 4 or 5 decades away, even at high growth rates, I think it's very important to consider what could happen now, what should happen now to allow that transition to happen in the future. Transition is not automatic. Dave just talked briefly about the framework on which we present our analysis. And he talked about these groups of 3, right? He talked about investment, infusion, innovation. He talked about the 3 components of the Schumpeterian approach to economic growth: creative destruction, so creation and destruction, but also the forces of preservation that tend to keep economies a little stuck. The 3 factors driving growth, right? Enterprises and productivity. Okay. I think I'm too close to this. And then the 3 main conclusions. This, yeah. And the 3 main conclusions that come from this analysis, the 3 main policy recommendations that you're going to see me repeat later are these 3 at the bottom. Discipline incumbents. What is incumbents? These are whether enterprises, whether arrangements, or state-owned enterprises, large companies that are set in the economy and prevent others from entering, arrangements in education where old structures, old organizations of teachers prevent, change in the economy. The second recommendation is on rewarding merit. We often talk about how important it is to have education system open to everybody. This is wonderful. But when you have universities where people graduate without learning anything, we're not rewarding merit. We're rewarding mediocrity. And so rewarding merit is absolutely essential to incentivize people to work hard, to put a lot of effort. And finally, capitalize on crisis. The biggest crisis we know is Russia's invasion of Ukraine of now 3 years almost. And that crisis created a profound change in the energy environment for the countries of Europe and Central Asia. Using that to secure energy, to ensure that our countries have the energy they need to develop is absolutely essential. So this is in broad terms. Now, look at this chart. Horizontal axis, income per capita in 1990, vertical in 2023. This is split in three parts each, and so we have 9 squares. This here is from here to here is low income, middle income, high income in 1990, correspondingly there for 2023. And so this here in the middle are countries that were middle income in 1990 and remain middle income in 2023. So these are the countries that we could say are stuck in middle income, right? Those countries that are at the bottom in the shaded area were middle income before, and they have become high income by 2023. So since 1990, 27 countries around the world have become high income. Of these, 10 are in our region, Europe and Central Asia: Estonia, Latvia, Czech Republic, Poland, and so forth. So if we add Greece, Portugal, and Malta, these three countries that are in the EU, they're not in ECA, Europe and Central Asia, we essentially have that half of the countries in the world that became high income since 1990 are in the European Union. This convergence machine, as we call it, that aligned institutions, provided a lot of trade and investment, brought the incomes of these countries, to these very high levels. Now, what has happened to the other countries? I mentioned these 10 countries have become high income since 1990, but we have another 20 countries that are now in our region, including Kyrgyz Republic, Tajikistan, countries of Central Asia, Caucasus, that have not become high income. What has happened to them? Well, the main characteristic of these countries is that we see their growth rates have stagnated. They have fallen quite dramatically. And as a result of that, their convergence, their levels of income relative to the European Union in this chart, we can pick the US as well, has not increased. Look at this. This black line here are the countries of Central Asia. This is their incomes relative to the EU, indexed to 100 EU. And so essentially since 2000 to 2023, the share of their income relative to the EU is up from about 20% to maybe to about 25%. Look at the countries of Central Europe, the red line, where their incomes relative to the EU has almost doubled. And so this problem with delayed convergence, slow convergence, lack of alignment of institutions, less trade, less investment is what this presentation is about. How do we make the countries, how do the authorities of Europe and Central Asia help these countries grow much faster and so therefore converge faster to European levels? We're going to look at these three main drivers of growth, essentially enterprises, main drivers of productivity, talent and social mobility, and I'm going to tell you why mobility, and then energy. So first, let me talk a little bit about enterprises and productivity. We asked these three questions. One, have these countries in Europe and Central Asia focused on really creating the business environment to have a much more dynamic economies, the environment of creative destruction? And the answer is partially, not really. You know from observing the economies of Central Asia that this business dynamism in the last several years has been much stronger than before, but by and large, we have not moved very decisively in that direction. And I'm going to show you a chart where when we look at firms, right, firm level data rather than the aggregate macroeconomy, much of the productivity growth in the countries in middle income Europe and Central Asia is driving by what we call reallocation. So firms, rather than growing because they improve their management, improve their talents inside the firm, actually are moving resources, from one area to another, maybe geographically, maybe from one type of business to another, because there are a lot of inefficiencies in the economy, as Dave mentioned earlier. Second, and I think this is something that we can talk about a bit more in detail about, a lot of the strategies of governments in the region focus on SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. And you may have seen this extensively. SMEs this, SMEs that. Let's give more credit to SMEs. But I'm going to show you that small and medium-sized enterprises, on average, are not the job creators. Many of them don't grow. Coffee shops, dry cleaning places, little repair shops, automobile garages. They don't create too many jobs. They don't grow over time. Who creates jobs? Well, two groups of companies. Young, dynamic startups that just emerge. They are the biggest job creators in any economy, Europe and Central Asia. And then some of the largest companies in the region create jobs, but they create jobs by a much smaller margin. They account for a lot of the jobs because of historical reasons, but they create very little in net terms. And finally, something that is always very interesting to understand: what makes for a vibrant economy? What do you need for a vibrant economy? Turns out that in Europe and Central Asia, it's not going to be a surprise to you. It's competition. You need to have a level playing field between private and public companies so that when you start a company, you can enter and not be worried that somebody's going to come, push you out, not allow you access, or worse, take all your shares and run away. The role of state-owned enterprises that often dominate, they're the incumbents, often push away private enterprises, do not allow entry. Lack of finance, often most of our countries lack long-term finance. Nobody can develop a long-term business having only access to credit of only 1 year or so. And then the quality of management is absolutely essential. You know from your own studies how important it is to have talented people in charge. So these are the three questions. Here is this discussion on what drives productivity at the firm level. These are sales per worker, because at the firm level, we often do not have good measures of productivity. So we have to have some shortcuts, and these are the shortcuts. Sales per worker is de facto only output per worker at the aggregate level. And you see when you have, so this is zero, these are net impacts. So if you have bars on the negative side, this means that for these companies, these factors that are in dark blue within firm, and I'm going to explain in a second what it means, they dominate and they decrease productivity. On the right side, you have factors that improve productivity. And so therefore, the dark blue are factors that are within the firm. Factors such as improvement in quality of management, improvement of the type of people you hire, better machinery. And between firm, this is the reallocation, firms moving from one area to another, moving from Osh to Bishkek, moving from banking to producing milk, right? And you see that for most middle-income countries in the region, and these are these top here, and I've shown only a few countries, the countries for which we have growth. Most of the factors that drive productivity growth have to do with this reallocation, except Kyrgyz Republic, but this is a bit of an exception. While in the high-income countries, Romania, Poland, it is this within firm factor that is super important. So Kyrgyz Republic is an interesting case. It's not just the reallocation, but it's also the within firm component. Actually, this is very, very interesting. And my colleague Gohar, if she were here, she's going to tell you of her own work on Kyrgyz Republic. She has done this very extensive analysis. So it's very interesting to see how all of this reflects on Kazakhstan. Now, in Europe and Central Asia, there are too many small firms. In all countries around the world, small firms, small enterprises dominate. They account for the bulk of firms. But in ECA, Europe and Central Asia, small firms are way too many, right? And they are way too many, and they also don't grow. So here you can see what is this in orange, what is the initial size of a firm that enters a market, no? Let's say a firm is created today. How many workers does it usually have? And you see it's usually 3 to 5 workers. Tends to be, in most of these countries that I've plotted here, 3 to 5 workers. But over time, after 5 years, you see that most of these firms actually grow by much less than, let's say, firms in the United States. I put the United States there simply to have a metric, right? Because otherwise we don't know what is good growth, what is strong growth, what is slow growth. And you see most of these companies don't grow. So they enter small, they don't grow too much over time. And this is the other thing that I mentioned. Mature firms, so firms that are older than 4 years, they destroy more jobs. So the orange bar, which is job destruction, is bigger than the blue bar, job creation. So they destroy more jobs other than for very large companies. So they destroy more jobs. So look at small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. It's these guys here. The mature SMEs destroy jobs. The young and startups create jobs. And so therefore, when we have policies, government policies, let's give money to SMEs, just to every SME. Well, usually, most of the SMEs are mature. So we tend to give money to these mature guys that actually do not create jobs. So why are we giving them money if they don't create jobs? So this is important, and this is good to start reframing policy, rather than giving money to small and medium enterprises, SMEs that do not generate jobs, have clear criteria. What needs to happen for you to give money to a particular company? Be innovative, maybe new with less than a year. Maybe it's in an interesting sector. But just giving money randomly to enterprises that do not create jobs and do not create value doesn't seem to make much sense. Now, I talk about SMEs not growing, right? So enterprises enter small, do not grow much over time. And as a result, because they do not grow much over time, there are too few, we call this the missing large. There are too few large firms in Europe and Central Asia. We call this the phenomenon of the missing large. But even those large firms that are there, they're not particularly productive. And we know why. A lot of the large firms in Europe and Central Asia are legacy SOEs in energy sector, here and there in banking, here and there in bakeries even, here and there in transportation, telecoms, railways. Many of them are not particularly productive. And you see in blue, the line with blue. So as employment increases, and this is in logs, so therefore it's not 4, this is log of the actual number, the sales per worker actually are plateauing, right? Rather than in high-income countries, the curve looks substantially different. So too few large firms, and even they are not particularly productive. Now, this is an assessment of market-based competition. What is the strength of competition in these countries? And you see, I plotted here quite a few countries from Europe and Central Asia, and some comparisons from, East Asia. This diamond is from 2006, the bar is from 2022, and so when the bar is below the diamond, it means that the assessment of competition in 2022 relative to 2006 has decreased. For example, here's the Kyrgyz Republic. This is the assessment of competition in 2006. The assessment of competition 16 years later is worse. And so here's the Kyrgyz Republic, here is Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan. And so for the countries of Caucasus and Central Asia, here is Armenia. So most of the countries of the Caucasus and Central Asia are here in this area. And so we have a more problematic competitive environment. What does that mean? It means that there's no level playing field between public and private, between large incumbents and small entry. And so it is not good for business development. It's not the dynamic environment you need to have much stronger and sustainable economic growth. Now, I kept mentioning about SOEs, and here is two charts from a study we at the World Bank did recently to try to assess the extent to which SOEs, state-owned enterprises, are present in our economies. You know the definition of state-owned enterprise, an enterprise in which the central government has at least 50% share, right? It's 50% or more share. Now, we said, well, this is rather restrictive. What if the local government, some local governments, a city or Mahala even has a share? What if the central government has a stake in the local government who has a stake? And so we said, let's look at all enterprises in which some level of government, no matter which, has at least 10% stake. And we're going to call that a business of the state, right? It's a larger set than just an SOE. And then we say, look, let's take the standard classification of sectors in the economy. There are 77 sectors according to that classification. And you say, in what percent of these sectors do we have that business of the state? An enterprise with a government stake, any type of government, of at least 10%. And then we have these red dots here. And we say, okay, Russia, Ukraine, Poland, in 100% of the sectors of these 77 sectors, there is a state-owned enterprise. And then we even come down Kyrgyz Republic here, and pretty much for all of them except Montenegro and Kosovo, two very small countries in the Balkans, there is enterprise with government ownership of at least 10% in half of the economic sectors. In Europe and Central Asia, the legacy of the previous system, the planned economy, is still very strong. We cannot get away from it. This is in enterprises, But you know very well, this is the same in education. In many countries around the world, private education is very prevalent, not in our countries. There is a private school here and there, but it's not very substantial. And here's another presentation of the share of these enterprises with at least 10% stake by some level of government. You know, in Europe and Central Asia, the share of the revenues of these enterprises, the share of GDP, is higher than in East Asia. East Asia, China, Vietnam, we have a much larger share of revenues of these enterprises. In our part of the world, how much has the transition from a planned to market economy progressed? I think it's a very interesting picture. And the other thing I mentioned is lack of long-term finance. I'm going to share the slides with you so you can see in detail, but it's important for firms to have long-term finance. It's important for them to have predictability. If you have only finance for 6 months, 1 year, it's very difficult to create a business. Same goes with venture finance, and you can see this as well. So let me talk briefly about talent and social mobility. And I'm going to tell you why I'm talking about social mobility. Now, when we talk about education, skills, talent, expertise, we can all agree, all of these are good things, no? And the more we have of them, the more education we have with better results, the better skills we have, it's a better thing, no? How about social mobility? Well, social mobility could be measured in many ways, no? For example, you can measure by income. Am I better off than my father is? We can also measure, you know, this is one difference, me relative to my father. We could say, well, let's measure not just me relative to my father, but me relative to my father compared to how my father was compared to his father. Is that difference in difference, we could say, is that difference higher? So we can measure the social mobility. We could, in this paper, we look at education. Is the number of years of schooling my children are getting more than me? And not just more than me, but are they more than how many years I got? And how does that compare to what I got relative to my father, right? And so that social mobility makes sense. Why does it make sense? Because, you know, we're talking about the middle income trap. On the personal level, lack of mobility, lack of, you know, perception that you're moving, that things are improving, that your children would have a better chance than you have, it's actually very important. If you don't have that social mobility, if you feel stuck, you feel like the world is not moving. This is the, I could say, the personal middle income trap, no? Talk about middle income trap for countries, personal level, if you're stuck, if you don't have a sense of progress, of change, of improvement, then you are apathetic. You don't care about what's happening to society. You may not vote. You may not support policies that in general are considered good. So that's why for us, it's absolutely essential to talk about social mobility. And we pose these questions, right? So one of the questions is based on the fact that in middle income countries, including the countries of ECA, there is less talent, the skills are lower than they are in richer countries. I mean, how do we know that? Well, the quality of education is much worse, unfortunately. Quality of education is worse. The quality of work often is worse. There is less talent, less skills, but it's also misallocated. We know almost half of the secondary school students in the countries of Europe and Central Asia, and in some countries here in Central Asia, 80% of the students get moved to vocational schooling, 8th, 9th grade, right? Way too early. They go learn skills that are perhaps not going to be very useful. And in many countries, we know explicitly they're not useful. They forget them after they finish school. They're not coordinated with industry. So therefore, they're not also, even if they could be used, they're not particularly beneficial. Students from vocational schools cannot go to university. With great difficulty, they can go to university. And so this talent is misallocated, right? So we have a problem. The second question is whether the countries are becoming more socially mobile, as I just mentioned to you. And we notice that the educational mobility, right, the mobility I described, is actually declining. And we have a question on migration, hugely important for this part of the world, but also these days with the changing global perspective on migrants and refugees, I think it's an issue everywhere. I'm going to talk briefly about that. Now, you know very well, and also from your country, that enrollment, meaning kids spend a lot of time in school. They spend a lot of years in school. And so you see here on horizontal axis is income per capita, on the vertical numbers of years of school, that even for countries such as Kyrgyzstan, I mean, kids spend on average the full primary, secondary education plus a year probably before that, and spend 11 and a half, 12, 13 years in school, spend a lot of years in school. So this access, everybody can go to school. No, this access is not the problem. What is the problem? Well, the problem is that in many countries, the school year is rather short. The school day is rather short. So even though they may go a certain number of years, the actual hours they physically attend in school are many fewer than they are in OECD countries. But then the other issue is that the quality of education is not good. See these lines? I mean, these lines here, the countries of Europe and Central Asia, and these are averages on top, East Asia, median. This is the European Union, and this is ECA median, right? And so you see that there's so many countries. Look at East Asia, right? I mean, look where ECA is compared to East Asia. And in East Asia, not a single country has become high income since 1990. In ECA, you know, I talked to you earlier, 10 countries have become high income since 1990. And many of these countries are here in the EU median. Some are here in this one. And so therefore we have this issue with poor quality, and quality is coming down. And if we measure 2012 to 2022, we have an actual decline in most of the scores of these countries. And this is, you know, you are probably aware of the PISA scores, the OECD test that's given to, you know, 8, 9 graders, 14-year-olds. Everywhere except Turkey, we have a decline over the last 10 years in their math PISA scores, the same results for reading and science. And yeah, and it's not just COVID, right? One could say, well, it's COVID 2019-20. It's not just COVID. It started way before that, as you saw also on the previous slide. As I mentioned, the problem with vocational education is acute. The difference between the red and the blue bar shows you how much worse that proficiency, meaning at least a score at least 2 on a scale of 1, 2, 3, 4 on the PISA score, what a huge difference there is on this. I mean, so you need look at this here. For example, in Kazakhstan, 40% of the kids that are in vocational schools are proficient, so have a score of at least to 40% of vocational. Albania, 15. So it's really, these are terrible scores. Yeah. Anyway, now we talked about the basic education. Basic education we call the primary and secondary. So we said access is not an issue, quality is the main issue. And so let's plot the quality of basic education here on the horizontal axis, and then we plot the quality of higher education, university education on the vertical. We draw, you know, this line, the regression line through them. And then if you wanted to say, well, whatever the quality of the basic education, if I'm on the line, like Romania is on the line, well, for given the quality of basic education, my higher education is commensurate. Okay, that's fine. But look at most of the countries are below the line. So meaning even for the poor quality of basic education, the quality of higher education is even worse. We don't need these charts to know. Of all the countries in Europe and Central Asia, there's only one university that is in the top 100 in the world. There are 9 in the top 500. And these 9 are in Russia and Turkey. There's nothing else in Poland. There's nothing else in any other country. So we have a problem at the basic education level. So primary and the secondary have a huge problem at the university level. It's very difficult to do, you know, technology adoption, bring technology from abroad, what we referred to earlier as infusion. Bring technology, adopt it, disseminate it locally. It's even worse to do in innovation, no? Create new processes and new products. How can you do that with this quality of education? So, and this final slide on this section is on this mobility, intergenerational mobility that measures the mobility of between, right, the different generations. You see, for example, here's a measure for ECA, the medium for ECA. Here is Kazakhstan. You see this decline is declining mobility. One is absolute, the other one is relative. I'm not going to bother you with this now, but just to say, even though we are reaching the threshold, I mean, we are reaching many years, so, 13, 14 years, maximum years of number of years of schooling. It's very difficult to be much more mobile, but nonetheless, we see this persistent decline in mobility across generations. Final section, I'm going to talk about energy, and you know why energy obviously is important. Every country that has become high income requires a lot of energy. High income economies consume much more energy than low income or middle income economies. They consume more energy on average, in aggregate, but per person, they consume less energy. The countries of Europe and Central Asia consume on average 3 times more energy than the countries of the EU per unit of GDP, no? So it costs, in terms of energy, 3 times more in our countries than it does in the EU. And so, therefore, imagine what would happen if through some policies, countries could reduce the energy use per unit of GDP. I mean, how much scale up these companies could do, no? If energy, right? And how much less disruptions to energy supplies to households, to enterprises there would be if you could do that and distribute this energy a bit more equitably. And so this is absolutely essential for us. Also is essential because for many countries in our region, subsidies for fossil fuels, for coal, oil, natural gas, are very large. We're actually the most heavily subsidized region in the world. Subsidies are about 5% of GDP. I mean, 5% of GDP. This is an astonishing number. And there are some of the countries like Kazakhstan, Russia, Serbia, that consume Azerbaijan that actually account for the bulk of this. I mean, of course, Russia accounts for the bulk, accounts for almost 70% of this, but the other countries also have numbers that are very, very high relative to GDP. So here we are, energy, and we have these 3 questions. One is whether our countries are reducing emissions while ensuring affordable energy. Well, they're just about there, right? So one interesting fact I'm going to show you in a second is that for many high-income countries, growth in output has actually decoupled from emissions, and our countries are just about there. So that's a positive. Now, this energy transition, the transition to lower energy intensity, meaning how much energy we use per unit of output, lower energy intensity, lower emissions, does that lead to economic growth? And the answer is, it's not automatic, right? So you need several things to do that, but it's definitely a possibility, and it's gonna create much, much stronger economic growth if the policies that to make this possible are pursued. And I'm gonna tell you about that. And finally, it's important to talk about, again, here we come again with the preservation, because in many of our countries, SOE, state-owned enterprises, dominate energy systems. And it's very hard to disrupt their instinct to preserve the status quo, to keep it as is. And I'm going to tell you briefly about that as well. So here is a presentation of some of the things I just mentioned. On the first one, on the very first panel, you see these are emissions per capita, right? So emissions per capita, 2000 is indexed to 100, and you see the countries of ECA is this red line. And so for these countries, for our countries, these 23 countries, emissions per capita now are about the same level as they were in 2000, a little bit higher. It's probably about 2% of 2%. That's remarkable. But look at the high-income countries. They have been able to reduce emissions per capita over the last 20-something years, 20 years. Now, I'm decomposing this, and you would see I'm decomposing this into these 3 terms, and you see if you multiply them, how they actually cancel out. This cancels out with this cancels out with that, and we get emissions to the population. but actually gives you this very useful representation that emissions per capita depend on income per capita. Sorry, this is wrong, per capita. And you see these, our countries have done remarkably well in terms of improving income per capita. Their energy intensity, the use of energy per unit of GDP has declined. Unfortunately, since 2015, it has stabilized, has not been declining since then. And the emissions intensity, what we call, how much energy, how much carbon emissions per unit of energy, it also declining dramatically. Now, all of this is very nice, except that because our country started in 1990 with very high levels of energy intensity, right? Despite these improvements, the top line, we're still the most energy inefficient region in the world. So now I talked earlier to you about this decoupling of growth in output. This light blue line and growth in emissions. In INECA, only these two high-income economies have achieved that. I mean, Serbia too. But look at Kyrgyzstan, look at Kazakhstan, Armenia. There, this growth has not developed. And so that's why my statement that's just about this growth in general. I can, yeah. So, so here's an interesting thing on this preservation, and this is my almost last slide. I have just one more. So, you know, these forces of preservation, what preserves the status quo in energy? Because these forces of preservation, they're present in the other areas that I presented about as well in a different guise. So what preserves? Well, there are these large fossil fuel subsidies, as I mentioned. They support SOEs. SOEs are not willing to adopt new technology, and they, of course, promote very inefficient energy use. The second one I mentioned, they dominate electricity systems. All transmission networks in these 23 countries I mentioned are state-owned enterprises. 80% of fossil fuel generation, coal, gas, is state-owned. This is double what is in other middle-income countries. I mean, how amazing is that? And distribution, right, the guys that come to your house at the very end, 67%. So finally, the final factor that determines this preservation of the incumbents is that this, I don't know whether you're familiar with this term, merit order dispatch. What's merit order dispatch? You know, in every country, so here too, there's a transmission operator that receives electricity or controls from which producer is going to get electricity at every moment. And the way this merit order, merit means, right, you know what it means, but at every moment, this transmission operator should pick the lowest cost first and then go to the higher cost. And so therefore, picks the lowest horse and then goes into the higher. And then the marginal price, so the price of electricity is obviously determined by the last part of electricity the transmission operator buys. And so therefore, often that is a coal-fired or natural gas-fired plant. But so therefore, instead of buying first from the lower marginal cost operators, the renewables, hydro, wind, the marginal cost, these are the lowest ones. Instead of doing that, these transmission operators override this and say, well, we're not going to buy first from the renewable because then maybe we have to close for a month our coal-fired plants. But they have to run at least with 60% capacity. And so instead of observing this merit-based order, they reverse it and they buy first from the lignite or other coal-fired plants. And so therefore, they preserve the status quo. So these are three of the important forces of preservation. Didn't talk about these things in the previous sections, but you can imagine similar forces are present throughout the economy. So finally, recommendations in this section. And I think it's interesting because often when we talk about the energy transition, we go immediately to saying, well, create more photovoltaic plants, right, solar panels, or more wind power plants, or more hydro plants. This is important. But for that to be effective, we have to start by saying you have to have markets. Markets and prices that reflect the true cost of the electricity energy produced. If prices do not reflect the true cost, what happens? I mean, if electricity costs actually, for example, 10 cents, but only 3 cents are charged, what happens? Individuals and firms waste it. Well, you don't want that. So you need prices to be right. Fossil fuel subsidies that promote inefficient use have to be phased out. And then some kind of carbon price, because there are a lot of externality from the fossil fuel plants, whether it's pollution, whether it's emissions, and so forth. These carbon prices have to be introduced. Second, enterprises, the productive enterprises in the economy, their structural transformation is still continuing. As you saw from my earlier slide, the reallocation of resources in the economy is ongoing. So that structural transformation, this transition from planned to market economy now in its 30th year, 35th year, has to continue, because this is the only process by integration into global markets, bringing more efficient technology. It's the only process these enterprises can have better, cheaper, more efficient technology. Otherwise, they're going to use the same old technology, inefficient. You look at the trucks in some of the streets in Central Asia, look at some of the buildings, public buildings, private business buildings. All of these things have to be renovated in order to create that better energy efficiency. Last but not least, these transmission systems have to be upgraded thoroughly. Why? Because a lot of the new renewable generation facilities are intermittent, right? The sun shines only during certain hours during the day. Wind doesn't blow constantly, doesn't blow necessarily in one direction. So these transmission systems have to be able to adjust to this intermittency in electricity supply. And the last one I talked about is this merit order dispatch. So I'm going to end here. We're going to send you the slides so you can download our report, Greater Heights, so on the countries of Europe and Central Asia. And thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Ivailo, for that fascinating overview, thought-provoking overview. We now have an extended period where we can have Q&A and discussion from the audience. So in a moment, I'll be coming to the audience. But if I may exploit my role as moderator, just to follow up on a couple of things that came to my mind as I was listening to your talk. Thinking in the context of where we are today, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan as well, and Uzbekistan and Central Asia more generally, if I understand correctly, we're at that point where we want to go from the first eye to the second eye. So towards this infusion, which is a sort of interesting term that I'm not that familiar with. But so I just wonder if the panelists could comment a little bit more on how that move from investment to investment plus infusion works, and specifically how it might work in Central Asia. And I just have in mind that this comes back to, like so many things in economics, comes back to political economy and the nature of government and policy making, and how policy becomes reality or doesn't. And so how much of this sits on the shoulders of government and policy makers, and what prospects are there? What are the challenges for governments in this region of really pushing the move from one eye investment to two eyes investment plus infusion?
Okay. Thank you, Dean Gerry. So, I mean, so this the terms so the WDR coined this used these terms to be a bit more interesting as a mnemonic, no? One eye, two eye, three eye. Even though the infusion is actually technology adoption, no? How do you adopt technology from abroad? Adopt technology, expertise, knowledge, foreign capital, no? And so therefore this shift from investment, and the idea here is largely the one eye, the investment, is largely the private sector investment. No? So here we don't, even though public investment obviously is investment, but this is more the private investment. And so how do you go from private enterprises focusing largely on investing to make something domestically without much foreign expertise? How do they move to where they continue to invest, but they also bring that knowledge and expertise and capital from abroad? And so obviously this integration with the global economy is crucial. And when you say, what is the role of governments? Well, role of governments is absolutely essential. Open the economy, make it more attractive to foreign capital, make it more attractive to foreign people to come in, set up foreign universities, bring knowledge, bring expertise. So I think this is absolutely essential, hugely essential role for government. It's not just that opening the economy. There's also, there's a need for some macro stability. Unstable economies, even if they are open, they usually don't attract foreign direct investment. So you need some stability, you need some predictability. Predictability in terms of policy, predictability in terms of policy rates. So the World Bank does these enterprise surveys for most of our countries, and Kyrgyz Republic has seen quite a few of these enterprise surveys. And so what some of the concerns investors, and these are largely domestic investors, have about the country are about the informal economy, about tax rates, right? So therefore, all of these things are things that are substantially in government control. How to create some predictability, how to create openness, how to create these conditions so that people can come and feel comfortable investing and then ultimately repatriating their profits. But my colleague Dave, yeah, please.
So, but if I could just follow up, because that all sounds very much like many other paradigms of analysis over the years. Macroeconomic stability, institutional development, et cetera, et cetera. I just wonder if, I looked at the report last night, and I think in the report or in some of the coverage around it, Estonia and Poland are picked out as success cases, whereas Brazil is picked out as a failure, as not having made
less successful,
as less successful, as not having made the shift along that path of technology adoption. Why is that? I mean, what is it that this framework, because it's presented as a simple framework for promoting long-term prosperity and growth, what is it about this framework that that governments in this region could pick up and understand what to do with? How to be Estonia and not Brazil, for example?
So in economics, narratives, having a clear narrative is very important, having a story. And so I think having a clear story of what drives development, what is necessary for development, is super important, because at the end of the day, policymakers, enterprises, people have to buy into it. And when you say what determines Estonia's and Poland's success, very early in this transition from planned to market economy, there was, let's call it a development bargain. There was a clear understanding among the political elites, among the citizens, among enterprises, what are the main priorities for the country? Main priorities were get as far as possible from the planned economy and all the political economy that underpin this as fast as possible. Get away from it. Put the institutions of a market economy, put the institution of a democratic society, improve dramatically education. Both of these countries had dramatic education reforms, and now they, you know, place 5 and 6 in the rankings on PISA, Estonia and Poland. So all of these things, they really went very strongly ahead. Now, something that helped tremendously was that the European Union was open to accept new members. And in the process of accession, both Estonia and Poland and others, Czech Republic and many others, aligned their institutions, political institutions, market institutions, all kinds of institutions, align them to those in Europe. After entry, there were massive structural funds from the European Union. There was massive private investment, enterprises from typically Germany, but some other countries as well, set up these value chains that ultimately ended up in Germany. And a lot of the enterprises that these foreign investors set up in Poland, in Romania, in Estonia, were extensions of Western European enterprises. They produced for Western European companies, and this process was self-reinforcing, right? Investment and trade and improvements in institutions came one after the other. So it's very hard to overstate, it's impossible to overstate how important the European Union was for the ability of these countries to actually become where they are today. It's also, you know, when you think of what about the other countries that are not going to be part of the European Union, so it's difficult. And one thing one could say is, well, you could mimic institutions, right? You could open up to the global economy, you could open up to global trade, but you also really need that, again, let me use this phrase, a grand development bargain between all social actors or policy actors in the country. What are the most important things? So you don't have to deviate from that path. If it takes you years to achieve basic, you know, improvements in education quality, in the quality of institutions, it's not going to be possible, no? And so you see some countries in Europe, my country, Bulgaria, has been a member of the European Union since 2007, has been less successful than Poland and Estonia, precisely because this development bargain was not as strong as it was in these countries. Yes,
I'll just add just very quickly. So kind of on the different angle, I think this report emphasized dynamic efficiency, right? So kind of in every direction, if you look at the talent allocation, energy use, enterprises, we are advising how dynamically through these stages improve efficiency. And in that, probably there is some innovation in that approach, in this emphasis on efficiency.
So, you know, this chart that Dave showed from the WDR, from the main report, where he said, from the middle income countries around the world, their physical and human capital is 70% of the level of the US. Here in ECA is about 78%. So if you say, well, let's take the 23 countries of Europe and Central Asia, measure imperfect. Obviously is imperfect because the way human capital often is measured is by a number of years of schooling. Well, this is obvious, but let's stay with this narrative for it. Measure human and physical capital and say, well, it's 78% of the US levels. Why are we not 78% rich as the US, but we are only 38% for Europe and Central Asia? What is this 40% difference? And this is the level of efficiency, no? The economists call this total factor productivity. This is the level of efficiency of converting this capital into output. And so how profound is inefficiency, no? I mean, it's as if you get 100 liters of water and you pour 50 liters out. So you get only, you know, 50% of what you put in.
Thanks very much. So before we open to the floor, I want to invite our Kyrgyz economist, Dr. Tilikeyev, to say a few comments on the talk.
Thank you. Actually, yes. I want to congratulate all of us that quite a big study was accessible for us, and thanks a lot for being today and sharing your knowledge, and probably we come to the very interesting discussion quite soon. I have several comments, or let's say from Kyrgyzstan's point of view. In general, like how it's formulated, and it's very well written report. It's very good thesis, and we can't ignore it. And for us, unfortunately, wouldn't be so easy task to transform it to, let's say, policy decisions, to business decisions, how to build a strategy using these thoughts. So my several reflections on the role of state, for example. As you know, Kyrgyzstan, one of the few countries gaining a lot from the, let's say, for the Europe, it was negative shock. For Kyrgyzstan, it was rather positive shock. Start of Russian war brings increased growth, economic growth during last several years. For the 2024, it was 9%. For 23, it was 6.3%, but it was recalculated somehow to 9% again. In 2022, it was 7.2%, then it was again recalculated to 9%. For previous, for 2022, I believe a little bit because methodology was changed. But for the 2024, anyway, it's more than 7%. I can say more or less, we can say we never have such economic growth during last several years. And it's because of Kyrgyz economy have certain structure where more or less service economy and service part of our economy increased. It's from 46, now it's 52, I think, %. And basically it's trade. We are becoming a very big hub of exporting goods from China to Russia. And it also allows Kyrgyz government to increase almost double government revenues. And there was a substantial increase investment in education, in healthcare infrastructure, in physical infrastructure. There were a lot of positive things which we can say. We cannot blame Kyrgyz government that Kyrgyz government exploit this opportunity to boost economic growth and increase again more rapidly to being, let's say, moving forward to along these middle income countries. If you calculate per capita income in market prices, it's increased from 1,400, I think. Now it's more than $2,000 for the 2024. So what's mistake? What kind of mistake I can observe in Kyrgyz government decision? We still have a parallel tax systems for small and medium enterprises. For we have several different tax regimes, which actually, when you're moving from the small to medium, you have increased taxation. When you move from the medium to big, you again have increased taxation, which actually prevents our, let's say, economy to being industrialized in previous, let's say, decades. But now we also, it doesn't allow companies to being bigger. I think from that perspective, this report is very useful. We can argue that if we want to build a more sustainable future with a more sustainable economic growth, we need to more or less say unify our tax burden across our taxpayers, irrespective of their size. Also, I want to mention two very interesting studies which we used, which we are implementing during last years. First of all, we recently finished our rural youth study in 4 Central Asian countries. And we found, yes, that unfortunately, many rural youth don't have access to labor market. Even, let's say, I can explain why it's not so, let's say, profitable for rural youth being educated. half of rural youth don't have any work. Most of it's women. And it's also very substantial educational mismatch. Most of the people receiving higher education never work on their main specialty, except of maybe education area, where basically it's almost all occupied by young women, and they receive education specialties and they work basically in school or educational areas. And also we can say, based on that study, we also can predict that migration from rural areas to urban areas, doesn't matter, it will be within the country or maybe outside the region, will be increased, specifically because when we're asking young people, specifically it was high among the young women from 18 to 23 years old. Around half of them, they don't want to stay in rural areas and continue the, let's say, participation in agricultural systems. Moreover, we need to say that in all 4 countries, about from employed youth, about 25% only working in agriculture. 75% of youth find their jobs not in agricultural systems. Any other jobs except of agriculture. It means they don't see a big future in that sense. Also, we are participating in quite a big OECD-led projects, Sustainable Infrastructure Program in Asia, SIPA. And one component of it related to Central Asia, and we have Central Asia plus Mongolia. It's by European classification. It's a little bit strange bringing Mongolia because it's quite different from other Central Asian countries. And we have prepared within the project 2 background documents on decarbonization. Manjira Junusova and Ablai Kosmogavetov, they prepared 2 background documents on transport decarbonization and energy decarbonization, yes. We have not stable investment in energy decarbonization structures. And there are actually very interesting findings. We found that it's very donor dependent. Most of infrastructure in renewable systems in, let's say, clean energy is basically driven by donors. And if exclude donor participation, it will, let's say, it will decrease overall investment in sustainable infrastructure maybe on 70%. That's basically all I want to say. And yes, we are more or less confident that main thesis presented in the report, I look on it, and also in presentation. It was quite fast. I see there are 40 slides you should present in 30 minutes, and you miss a lot. It's because it's quite a big study, and it was to analyze it. And I think it's quite a useful exercise, analytical exercise, which might be useful not only for us as scholars, but also for public agencies, governments to trying to, let's say, to be in the loop and understand what the future we need, what the future we want to build. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Kanat. Misha, did you want to say anything in general before we go to questions? Or no. So let's open to the floor for questions. I don't know if someone has the microphone. There's one here, and then there's someone at the back after that. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation and very engaging discussion. When we talk about Central Asia, probably we should not ignore the fact that Central Asia was classified or termed by various economists and political scientists as the best pupil of World Bank and IMF. Central Asia has received economic expertise and advice from the World Bank and IMF since 1990s. And my question is, if we try to receive key messages from this report, what kind of industrial policy does this report advertise for? So it means that it requires less state intervention. That's one of the messages that I received. So does it mean that it implies fiscal consolidation, reduction of public services, or neoliberal reforms? Because some of the presenters mentioned also that there is the private sector is not that big in the education sector, for instance, in Central Asia. So in that sense, are we advocating for more free market economy, or there is still a role for state to play? And like one of the issues that was not addressed is the role of elites in this process, because those examples of successful countries from Eastern Europe, like Poland and Estonia and others, if you look at political science literature, you will see that there was a national consolidations of political forces that promoted inclusive institutions, eradication of corruption, and reduction of rent seeking. So how we avoid that in Central Asia if we want to escape that middle income trap? Thank you. My name is Bakijan Kurmanov. I'm a senior research fellow at IPPA at UCA here.
Thanks, Becky. Let's take the second question from the back as well, and then we'll.
Thank you. My name is Alijon Rosik. I'm from Afghanistan, OSCE Academy, in OSCE Academy. My question is that first, I want to thank you for your eye-opening presentation, as you have discussed about the creative distraction and also political institution, economic institution. To have a sustained economy, first we need to have a very inclusive economic institution. And for this, first, I want to know the relationship between political institution and economic institution, and to have economy institution, inclusive economy institution. What kind of political institution we need first? And also, I want to know the kind of the vicious feedback loop between the political institution and also economic institution. Thank you.
Who wants to have a go at those questions?
So let me start with a question on industrial policy. So, we're talking about growing to high income. What you find typically in life is that this initial stage of development, what we call investment, it could be done obviously with substantial state intervention, directed credit. And we've seen in many of the countries of Central Asia, directed credit to companies, they invest. So that can happen. But then as you grow richer, the likelihood that the state can direct economic activity in a way that could raise your income substantially falls to zero. Countries are not growing to high income absent natural resources by government decision or government guidance. The private sector is playing a decisive role, right? Because governments don't innovate typically. They don't want to take risk. The private sector takes risk, whether it's to venture capital or something else. And so the role of the private sector in this transition to high income has to be much larger, right? And so that's what we are saying here, that for many countries, not just in Central Asia, across Europe and Central Asia, around the world, the bigger report of middle income chart, all of the private sector has to become there. And for that private sector to be driving this infusion, bring foreign expertise, and then innovation obviously needs financing, needs managerial expertise, needs talent, needs educated people. Now, is there a role for the state? Oh, absolutely. Education. I mean, in most of our countries, as I mentioned, education is still a state provided, resource. Why is the quality of education not very good? No? Why do kids go to school for 13 years and then don't learn as much as some others in Singapore that go to school for 7 years, for example? So, there's a huge role for government to improve the quality of education. On the private sector side, competition. If you have a poor playing field where large enterprises, whether the state-owned or dominant private enterprises, which we call incumbents here, prevent private enterprises from rising, hiring people, obviously that's not good. So huge role for government to create this level playing field to observe it. Safeguard property rights, safeguard the rule of law, no? Safeguard safety, safeguard that macro stability with us. A huge role for the government. Energy transition. I mean, state-owned companies dominate the energy systems. And if left on their own, we're not going to see any energy transition. So huge role for the government here. Now, so I don't know whether this is any industrial policy. Industrial policy, typically, we tend to think of industrial policy being potentially even useful when you have governments with very strong capacity to define what exactly industrial policy, what type of industrial policy you need, to design it, to monitor it, and then stop it if needed. No, I don't think many of our countries are at that level. And we're at a stage where industrial policy requires a lot of money, no? Microchips, electric vehicles, artificial intelligence. We are not, our countries, not just here, but also the whole Europe and Central Asia. Most of the countries in the European Union as well don't have the resources to do these things. But there's plenty in Europe and Central Asia to do on these areas I mentioned, on the energy side, on the competition side, on the education side. So this is mostly horizontal, but there obviously could be, interventions to support this, to make this possible. So yeah, I think role of the elites, absolutely. And when you mentioned national consolidation of political forces, I didn't mention that, and I don't know what that means. I meant that in Estonia and in Poland, in some of these countries in Eastern Europe, there was an understanding that, these are our most important things. No, let's get away from the planned economy as quickly as possible. Let's improve the quality of education. These are the main strategic directions. Other things emerged over time, obviously, that, resulted in opposition, this and that, but there's no consolidation of political forces. So within a democratic system, how do you say, what, let's agree on what's most important? So, on education, how do you get a national consensus and not the political forces only? How do you get an understanding? Well, we need a much better education and let's work towards it. No, how do we get an understanding? We need strong, sustainable growth year after year, even without a war, even without Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How can we generate, 7% growth for 20 years? No?
That's a question.
Yeah, because 7% growth for 10 years means you double your GDP per capita in 10 years. So from, let's say,
1,000 to 2,000.
1,000 to 2,000. Another 10 years to 4,000. Another 10 years to 8,000. You're still so after 50 years, you could presumably go to high income. It takes time, right? So it takes time, and this consensus on broad issues, not on everything, right? I mean, we're not agreeing here on minor details. So you mentioned also this education. I don't mean we need to get the government out of education. I mean that, in many other countries, in Latin America, in East Asia, the private sector plays a role in education. Not here, right? And obviously there's a legacy, there's the expectation that the government is going to do a lot of it. There are very few private schools that are affordable for, the average person. They are elite private schools, secondary, elite universities. So I think we're going to see that happening because obviously the state, the government in most of our countries is going to be constrained, no? There's population aging in some of the countries that would require more resources. There probably would have to be more defense spending in many of the countries in Europe. There's going to be more money for various other issues. And so governments are going to constrain the private sector. People would have to take charge of some of these issues. Yes, please, of course. Yeah.
I will said, like on the way here, I was driving in the car with Hugh, and I was telling him about this economist, which I misspelled. His name is Hirschman, Albert Hirschman. Right, and so I don't know if you heard of him. So he was like old timer, like in 60s. But essentially, his idea of development was, let's observe what a country does well, and just help them to succeed in that direction. And so I think kind of why I bring this example here is that I think you formulated the question as a kind of in a very big terms, like kind of solve everything. And I think maybe we are more humble here in this report. Indeed, going back to efficiency, we identify these 3 areas that seems to be very relevant for Kyrgyzstan: energy, education, and allocation and talent, and firm productivity. And we just discuss what are the ways to improve efficiency dynamically once you move along in that direction. I think it's much less ambitious as you presented, but it could be on the other hand more practical. So I think that's maybe our flavor of this report. So that's, and by the way, maybe to answer the second question, if you think about efficiency is, in my view, and I understand I'm simplifying things, by definition, it's apolitical. Efficiency, we can improve efficiency in any way. So it's less political to me. It's more kind of pure economics, right? So how to improve it. I fully understand that political economy is super important. Still here, there's one direction where we can push it relatively clean.
So, your question also, what kind of institutions you need? Huh? Look at our recommendations, 3 of our main recommendations. No, one is to discipline incumbents. So, these inclusive institutions, right, that Asemoglu and Robinson talk about, to me, an initial stage is to say, in every society in countries of Europe and Central Asia, there are incumbents. So in business, these are large SOEs or large enterprises that prevent the entry of newcomers. No, in energy, transmission networks should be connecting new small renewable producers. Often they do not because they don't have capacity. So these are incumbents. SOEs dominate even sectors we call competitive, right? And then new entrants cannot come in. So these incumbents have to be disciplined so that new entrants can come in. In education, what prevents in most of our countries where you saw results on PISA or on anything else, universities declining, what prevents these things from improving more dramatically? No, and so there's again incumbents, whether it's in university management, whether it's in governments, whether in society, whether it's teacher organizations that prevent changes in the structure of teaching, of merging universities with research institutes, and so forth. So these incumbents have to be disciplined, and they're everywhere, right? So, and in every society, there are incumbents, and you have to have this way to moderate them. The other thing that we mentioned is reward merit. I mentioned, I think, in school, we often say schools, universities are open to everybody, and that should be the case. They're open to everybody, but being open to everybody to enter a university is subject to obviously exams because we have limited resources. But should everybody graduate? No. If you don't do well, you shouldn't be graduating because this costs a lot of money. The taxpayer pays a lot of money. People should not be getting just diplomas from public universities on the public purse, even if they don't have the merit, no? And by not rewarding merit, you create this vicious circle where, everybody, falls in thinking, oh, it doesn't matter, I'm going to pass the exam, I'm going to do it. I'm putting universities here because it's so crucial, so important for the future of the country, determines the path people take and so forth. And then I think the other thing on the institutions is how do you take advantage of crises that happen? So the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the COVID crisis, There was the European debt crisis in 2011 or 12, right? There are all these crises. How do you take advantage of these to improve what is not going well? So in our case now, how do you use the latest episode, the various crises? How do you use that to create more secure, more stable, abundant energy? How do you change things? And I think these are the types of institutions. So it needs this type of government flexibility, market flexibility you need to. And so we can also talk about politics, but politics is a bit less important here because these are the crucial things: disciplining the incumbents, rewarding merit, and using crisis to your advantage.
Thanks very much. We have a question online, the inevitable question about AI. How does AI impact employment and population mobility in middle-income countries? Does it serve as a driver of development, or does it pose a threat by potentially displacing higher educated professionals who otherwise would contribute to economic growth?
So I think when we talk about AI and jobs, I mean, there are obviously three scenarios, right? Either AI is going to replace people, no? I mean, let's say, as of now, there's all the evidence that AI is replacing basic coders, no? People who code some basic instructions in some language. So just these people, no? Some people do basic coding. There are all these data, I mean, 100,000 fewer programmers in the US because AI has replaced these basic coders. Now, so this is a replacement. The other one is it's augmenting, all right? Augmenting what people can do. So there's this software called Expert that reads X-rays, right? And so it has been found that doctors so this software, if you give X-rays to the software and say, okay, provide diagnosis, it's not particularly useful. And, it's unacceptable risk for doctors to give X-rays only to the expert. However, doctors using the software found to be 60% better at putting the right diagnosis than doctors that don't use the software. No? So it augments the skills of these doctors. There was a physics Nobel laureate, Mr. Hinton, who in 2016 said, because of this software, by 2024, for some reason, he said, all radiologists, so the people who read X-rays and other mammograms and all radiologists would be out of work. And that obviously not only has not happened, but there are more radiologists now because using that software and other softwares like that, they do other things, right? Rather than just reading this and saying, okay, you have this, you have that, they do many other things. So, right, this enhances the skill. And the other thing that AI does, and this, by the way, is typical of all technological revolutions, no? I mean, so when they invented the automatic teller machine in the 60s, so the worry was, oh my God, automatic teller machine, you can go to the ATM, you can withdraw money, everybody in the bank is going to lose their jobs. I mean, not only this has not happened, but these people who are sitting behind, the guichet in the banks and were giving out money now are doing other things. They're providing other services. And so, all technological revolutions, the new appliances, whether robots and now AI, have either they replace workers, they augment their skills, or they create new opportunities. And so AI is obviously going to create new opportunities. I mean, now there are driverless taxis in some cities around the world. Now, whether the risk of that is unacceptable, I don't know. But okay, there are driverless taxis. There would be remote operators of these driverless taxis in some critical situations. There would be, AI is being used increasingly to, when scientists synthesize various substances, I mean, what do? They say, okay, here is how we want the substance to look like. Now let's go manually, or with the help of a computer and a program, let's go manually to see what compound, what elements or compounds could create this final formula. Now AI does this much faster. And so these scientists are actually something different rather than the old-fashioned, types that would look at the final output, try to combine. So I think, I obviously don't know in which direction AI will go. Clearly, a lot would depend on what governments, how governments decide. No, I mean, in many of our countries, pensions and health are paid from payroll contributions. I mean, if you have AI and robots, how are you going to tax them? Whom are you going to tax? Should we shift all taxation to general, or all pensions and health to general revenue? No. So, which direction would government go? There would be those people who are displaced. Would governments have a more substantial role in retraining and so on? So, I think huge role for the government, for the state here, as you said, industrial policy. But yes, but so obviously it depends on which direction governments will do. And I mean, you see different approaches in the US where, go ahead, tech companies, do your thing, and we'll see later whether we can regulate. There's a bit more preeminent regulation ex ante in Europe. So obviously it depends hugely on what governments could do, but I think it's going to be like every technological revolution. Things usually in the short term are not as drastic as we expect. In the long term, they are much more substantial than we think.
I just want to add one thing. So the question was formulated as if AI technology is a substitute for some occupations, but it also could be a complement. And in the occupations where AI is a complement, we will clearly see, and I think we already see that, and I can attest by myself using AI, that it will drive inequality, because the most kind of effective people assisted by AI will become much more effective, and those who are not that effective will not proceed. So AI and inequalities, I think it's important dimension that not very much discussed right now.
Thanks very much, Misha. There's one hand here and then here.
Hello, I'm Saulia Chalbasov from University of Central Asia. How does climate change and sustainability fit into the framework of escaping the middle income trap?
So then there was one just behind. Apply.
Thank you very much. My name is Ablaidus Mugametov. I'm research fellow in data analytics here at IPPA. So thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to ask more kind of methodological question regarding one of the presentation related to productivity, to labor productivity. So I carefully read the footnote, and there is a written note that some sectoral as well as here times fixed effects considered in this study. And of course, we saw that there is a big gap between high income countries and the middle income countries. So my question is that did World Bank team also consider, let's say, country fixed effects in that study, or region fixed effects factor? Because we have different settings. If we even consider Central Asia with East and Central Europe, there is a different climate, different access to water resources, and other unobservables, let's say, right, which may change over time and among countries. So this may affect the gap between high-income countries and the middle-income countries. So that gap can be either shrinked or maybe enlarged. So basically, did you consider that in your report? Thanks.
So and your question is whether we use country fixed effects or regional fixed effects. But we in the footnote we said we use a country fixed effect and time fixed effect, right? On the sector, yeah. Okay, yeah, but you know, again, you know, it's difficult for us to react on that. But I can tell you that we tried different specifications, but one of our limitations is that you know, the degrees of freedom is quite low because, you know, it's a country, so we couldn't introduce all fixed effects at the same time. But I guess we could, you know, we again, I am assuming we tried different specifications, and we have a sensitivity analysis section that address your question. Okay.
You know, I don't know what exactly you refer to. Why don't you tell me which later? Tell me which exactly? No, seriously, because I cannot see which one it is. But this is the report. Oh, you mean the?
Oh, presentation.
Okay.
Okay. But
Okay.
also you can answer on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, obviously we have several important things. One is that not just Central Asia, but most of the countries in ECA spend very little on adaptation. And so as a result, we have very substantial damage, right? From natural disasters, from flooding, and so on. And so I think this is a shock. And some of our reports on these climate reports quantify this. The other problem with adaptation is that most of our countries do not have the proper insurance mechanism. So farmers, people working in agriculture, or apartment owners, house owners can insure their property, right? And not just insure in case of disaster, but also these insurance mechanisms in other places, you know, prompt people and firms to take preventive action, no? Not build houses in areas that could be affected by, you know, by mudslides, by torrential rain, and so on. So I think this issue on adaptation and resilience is is huge for our countries. Now, on the other side, on the mitigation side, I mean, clearly, most of the countries have committed to reaching various right, net zero scenarios. Many of them are working towards these net zero scenarios, but you know, we still see that, you know, Poland, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Russia still have very substantial use of fossil fuels in their electricity generation. Now, Turkey is an incredible example where the government, because the fossil fuels it imports all of its oil, I mean, almost all of its oil and natural gas, generates $50 billion or so a year import bill, and so they are going full speed ahead with renewable energy to try to negate that export. So it's many of our countries are doing something. I think obviously is hugely depends on their commitments. You saw some of my charts where it's only for some of the high-income countries in the region we have this decoupling between emissions, growth in emissions, and growth in output. So obviously we are still far from there. One, two, we still have this huge gap of how much energy we use in our countries, no? Per unit of GDP. So this energy inefficiency is tremendous, 2-3 times energy inefficiency, and part of it depends lack of markets and prices, lack of carbon taxes, slowdown in structural reforms that also help with this transformation of the economy, importing infusion of more energy efficient foreign technology, right? So there's so much to be done, and you know, the World Bank has produced these reports to try to assess the degree to which these countries are working towards some net zero scenario, and you know, it's going to take quite a bit of work, but absolutely, climate change is going to have an impact on our countries. Have you seen any of these reports called Climate Change Development Report, CCDR? We've done on Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, on almost all of them. Some on Tajikistan and Kyrgyz are under preparation. Tajikistan is done, yeah. Kyrgyz is going on. So on Central, yes, of course, yes.
This year, UNDP announced, I think last week, that national determined contributions will be updated. And probably we will collect more recent information, because up to the moment, for example, I look on agriculture, it doesn't look that we are doing anything in that regard. So we have 5 years basically remain to change it. Maybe cost effectively with the least investment, we can reach some positive, at least non-increase, and maybe in some sectors, decreasing of emissions. Yeah.
So it's 4 o'clock. I have one question from online, and then I'm going to finish with 2 of my own, which I'll invite you one by one to reflect on. So the question from online relates to the issue of minimum wage and whether this framework says anything about whether countries at the bottom of that middle income scale, like Kyrgyzstan, should be thinking of that in the context of inclusive growth and so on and so on. So that was one question. Then just 2 things that come to my mind. One is we've mentioned I think you referred to them as the evolving headwinds with the protectionism emerging and so on. In the context of what we saw about the EU and the importance of collaboration and regional integration and so on, what's the implications for the middle income countries of a world that becomes more protectionist? And then finally, you talked about the 7%, 7% for Kyrgyzstan. Is this the first 3 years of the 50 required to get into the high income category, or is this is it that the tasks that need doing haven't yet been done, and this is really nothing to do with that journey? Thanks.
And I'm just using it because it's easier to calculate. 72 divided by 7, 10 years. No, yeah. I'm just coming up with, some ambitious target, but yeah. No, the headwinds, more protectionist worlds, geo-economic fragmentation, obviously not good. And for small countries that do not have the population size, the resource size to scale up, they have to depend on being able to integrate into some market, regional market, global market. This is how the countries in the western part of this Europe and Central Asia region became much wealthier, And similarly, most countries of Europe, of the Caucasus and the resource-rich countries of Central Asia and the Caucasus, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, integrated into global markets, They export oil and natural gas, other natural resources. That's how they became rich. It's very difficult for a small country to become rich, which is to become rich without these global markets. So more protectionist world would mean a much more difficult conditions for becoming high income. And so together with slowing domestic reforms, I think that prospects do not look very good. And so therefore, the way I think we should think about this is to say, well, it's difficult to change what's happening in the world, but you can definitely change what's happening in your country. These headwinds, more protectionist world, are not going to determine how more efficient you could be using your energy, how better you could be on your education, how more competitive how more domestic competition could be in terms of balancing, right, the interests of large and small companies. And so I think there's so much that could be done domestically, regardless of these global headwinds. Misha, you want to comment on the minimum wage? We are not talking about the minimum wage. Most countries around the world have minimum wage. I think one thought that comes from various experiments in recent years in some countries in the eastern part of the EU is that if you increase your minimum wage out of that's not in line with productivity, this doesn't spell anything good, even though it may seem on the moment to be pro-poor but it's not good. But we're not talking about minimum wage in the report, so.
Well, no, maybe Kanat, you can finish by commenting on whether this, 9%, 9%, 9%, or whatever it is the beginning of the long journey, or whether it's a windfall from circumstances. But
since the reason of being on a high economic growth rate in Kyrgyzstan, we in general in previous period we have, if you look on the maybe 20 years previous, let's say, history, it was about 4% on average, if you look historically. So it's actually double of our economic growth. And what another change already happening in Kyrgyzstan? We are now in the process of a demographic transition. I think you remember we discussed it a little bit. And as a part of this process, we will have less population growth. But also we can expect that we will have more people on the labor market. So it will be critical for Kyrgyzstan to create a lot of jobs, specifically in rural areas. Otherwise, all these people will migrate somewhere else. Specifically, if we look on the participation of females in labor markets, about 45% in the region, and 75% in rural areas, actually. So we can expect that if women don't have a lot of kids, they basically will migrate together with husbands or alone. In reality, it's already happening in Kyrgyzstan. It's not so widespread in other countries in the region that females migrating a lot. What we already saw that about 40% of Kyrgyz migrants, labor migrants, are women. And it's slowly increasing in the neighbor countries also. In Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, it's about 10-15% in reality. But if Kyrgyz government wouldn't think of creating new jobs, supporting business, I think we may see the popularization of areas where life is very hard. It's south part of Kyrgyzstan. It's a significant proportion of our mountain territories where not so many people live in reality, like Norin province, Issyk province, Talas province. It's very low populated areas, and potentially it will be depopulated in the future. But let's be positive, and we hope that Kyrgyz government already trying to incentivize, let's say, fertility rates through providing high subsidies for new kids, but only for the remote, rural, mountainous areas. I think it should be more or less. We know in reality that in a global, let's say, aspect, it doesn't really work, but it somehow may support a bit, specifically if we talk about rural population. Sorry for not so positive response.
Great. One very last question for Marcel, and then I'm going to ask Hugh just to say a couple of words.
Yeah, it's just a short note which was inspired by Kanat's comment. I just very critical to kind of theological way how we perceived development. So even this concept of middle income trap suggests that we should be developed, etc., etc. And just a suggestion, I think probably if we will consider also contradict kind of pathways, it will enrich our understanding that development could work in a different kind of direction. So that's my short comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Asel. Asel, could you bring the mic down and unless you want to come up, Hugh?
Let me. So, do you want to say anything before I? No. I can just really to say thank you first and foremost to you Chris and the whole team at UCA. Kanak, thank you for your participation. You know, the World Bank, we generate a lot of analysis. I mean, the World Development Report is a big one, but generally we do a lot of analysis. The important thing, in my humble view, is how we communicate the analysis and how we listen. The quality of our listening is probably more important than the quality of our talking. And today, I think, has been a great validation of the importance of coming together and sharing and listening, as well as talking. So I want to thank you for providing that space and pay tribute to UCA's work in Kyrgyz Republic. We have in the World Bank some reports coming out in the coming months, the Country Economic Memorandum and the Country Climate and Development Report, which will domesticate some of these larger trends, larger theories. So we will reach out again, actually, Chris, and I hope that we can have further discussions a little bit more focused on the Kyrgyz Republic, because so many of these ideas, Ivailo, that you have been talking about today, whether it's on education quality, energy issues of state-owned enterprises and the role of government in the economy, the role of SMEs, how do we generate jobs, the importance of job creation. It's really burning issues for the Kyrgyz Republic. And it's extremely energizing and motivating to have this wider perspective as we continue to engage here. Tomorrow, the team will be having the same discussions with the government of the Kyrgyz Republic. We hope to continue our very active dialogue with the authorities on all of these issues. And we're very proud of the work that we're doing with them on the energy sector, on the education sector, with SMEs, and on climate change. So let me finish there. And thank you and the colleagues once again. Ivailo, thank you for bringing this to Kyrgyz Republic. We really appreciate that. And it's a perfect matchup actually with UCA, because through you we can talk to others. So thank you finally for participating, for giving us your time today, and for being so active. Great. Thank you. Spasibo.
So just finally for me, to reiterate the thanks to the panel that Hugh just expressed. Thank you all very much. And thank you to the audience for being here and those online. And for those here, there is some light refreshments just outside the room for those that want to stay around and have a chat. A few of us will linger, no doubt. And you're welcome to join us. But thank you very much. And thank you once again, colleagues.